How many laws do we need? If our elected representatives can't be troubled even to read the laws they enact, why should we be required to obey them? Jim Babka, the founder and head of the activist group Downsize DC, points out that last year the United States Senate enacted 318 bills totaling 7,103 pages. The House passed 381 bills totaling 7,889 pages. How many of those pages were read by the people who approved of those new laws? And who actually wrote those bills in the first place? When the American Republic was created, the founders believed that Congress would be populated by citizen statesmen who would render a brief term of public service and then resume their private affairs. They also believed that Congress would be restrained to a relatively modest role in our national life. They would be astonished, if not horrified, to see that Congress has become a lucrative career, that it appears to recognize no limit on its power to regiment our lives, and that most of its legislation is actually written by anonymous, unaccountable staffers, and often by special interest groups who benefit directly from the laws that are passed. What can be done to clean up this mess? We'll discuss this with Jim Babka, who says that the first step towards a solution is something simple and obvious. Jim, Congress is generating hundreds of new laws each year that occupy thousands of pages of text. Is there something we can do to slow down this juggernaut?
Well, Downsize DC has a couple of proposals, the Read the Bills Act and the One Subject at a Time Act. The One Subject at a Time Act was introduced in the House during the previous term, and we expect it to be reintroduced this year. And the Read the Bills Act, we are still looking for a sponsor, but we think we're fairly close. The Read the Bills Act would deal with this problem of them voting very quickly without having actually consumed or reviewed what it is that was put in front of them. This so-called Fiscal Cliff, what I prefer to call the fiscal curb. This was passed in the Senate in mere minutes after printed copies were made available to U.S. senators. And our bill would require that it be posted online for 7 days after a final reading of the bill out loud to the entire chamber, and that that bill would also be posted online for the public to see during that period. The One Subject at a Time Act would stop them from doing this clustering where they take unrelated ideas and put them together, and they make these really long bills that cover multitudes of topics that are very hard to understand, very hard to follow, very hard to read in the first place. And so I think these two proposals would go an awful long way towards beginning to modify the procedures and making sure that not only that they had read their bills, but that watchdog groups like Downsize DC, media groups such as yourself, and individual citizens would be able to read those bills too.
Now, Jim, you just mentioned the fiscal cliff. I want to talk about that because the recent budget compromise to avoid it was written by congressional staffers and enacted without even being read. How often does this actually happen, bills not being read in Washington?
Well, most of the time, frankly. If the bill's more than a handful of pages, you should not expect that hardly any members of Congress have read it. And if the bill gets very long, no members of Congress have read it. And the bills that tend to be passed after lots of negotiations that have gone on, right before they go home from a session, they're going home for vacation or they're ending their term, whatever it is, those bills almost never are read by anyone.
Now, Jim, the ancient Roman historian Tacitus famously said, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. What does the endless proliferation of federal laws tell us about the condition of our own government?
Well, I think he's right that it's corrupt, and I think that the reason it's real interesting because if the Read the Bills Act and the One Subject at a Time Act had been the law of the land before, several years back, then the crimes that Jack Abramoff has admitted to committing in his own writing, in his own book, would not be possible. He laid out kind of his entire technique for getting this done, how they would insert language into unrelated bills, the type of language that they would write, so it was hard for anybody to understand, the way that they would make sure that people couldn't understand what was being modified. Every one of these things, without getting into all the tiny little details, are dealt with in the One Subject at a Time Act and the Read the Bills Act. So it would make it a lot harder for them to proliferate these laws in the way that they do and to be unaccountable in the way that they do them. But mark my words, Gary, they intend to be this way because they are trying to take care of the people who helped get them into office, the people who have some control over their political future. And it is very, very hard to say no in Washington, D.C., because no might earn you an enemy, but yes might win you a friend. And after all, it's not their money, so it's a whole lot easier to say yes.
Your organization promotes a measure called the Enumerated Powers Act. Could you describe it and explain why you think that it's important?
Well, the Enumerated Powers Act was actually passed into the House, and now it needs to be passed into the Senate. And what it says is at the beginning of every bill, they have to specify from where in the Constitution, chapter and verse, if you will, they derive their authority to do what they're doing. It would be real interesting to get a sneak peek into the minds of our members of Congress and why they think they have the authority that they do. But it would also, I think, be a tool for judges and justices as they're looking at the law to see if indeed it does match the legal foundation that they're attempting to apply to what they're doing. And maybe, just maybe, on some occasions, it might slow them down or even embarrass them to suggest that what they're proposing is constitutional. Maybe a bill doesn't get introduced because it doesn't really have a constitutional grounding. And at the end of the day, we have a chance to use this as an educational opportunity to have this in the bill, to see what's in there and what they thought their thinking on this was. So I think it's not the most powerful tool that we have, but I still think it's valuable. It's a good tool.
Jim, all members of Congress swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, yet only a small fraction of the body bothered to attend a reading of the Constitution a couple weeks ago. Could you estimate what portions of the current Congress have ever actually read the U.S. Constitution?
No, it'd be very hard for me to do that. I would actually assume that most, if not all of them, have at some point in their career or lifetime have read the Constitution. But there's a difference, Gary, between having read it, understanding it, and then actually appreciating it. And I think that there's hardly any of them. In fact, the evidence is very, very ample that almost none of them have any appreciation for the Constitution, and that vanishingly few understand it. We have these anecdotes that sneak out where congressmen say, well, I derive my power to pass Obamacare from some clause that could be found instead in the Declaration of Independence, or a misunderstanding of the General Welfare Clause. So I think the fact of the matter is that very few of them understand it, and almost none, if any, appreciate it.
James Madison warned that the most dreadful enemy of public liberty was permanent war because it produces armies, debts, and taxes. The founders gave Congress the sole power to declare war and to regulate the U.S. armed forces. Has Congress abdicated that role to the executive branch and perhaps even to international bodies like the United Nations? And if so, what can be done about this?
Well, this is a very difficult issue, and I don't have any easy answers for what can be done about it, but I do agree with the premise of the question. The authorization to use military force was a rather broad blanket appeal, and the problem that we're having, for example, with an issue like the National Defense Authorization Act, where it allowed for indefinite detention, or as I like to more accurately call it, kidnapping, that actually was based and grounded in the authorization to go out and engage in this war on terror. It's open-ended. It gives the president broad powers, and other laws have since been grounded in it, further complicating the web in which we find ourselves now. And what's really sad is that I think too many members of Congress actually have the Pentagon's or defense contractors' interests ahead of the interests of the American people at this point. And they stir us up to war and get us all interested. Some of the other choices in the media have been very complicit in trying to build up the support for war. So I think we have a large educational thing that we need to do. And I think at every one of these issues, Gary, it always comes down to what we have to do the most, what matters the most is winning the battleground of our neighbor's mind, the district of their heart, and the precinct of their conscience. If we can begin to get them to understand the true cost to them and their family and their loved ones and their community for war and what is possible with peace, then I think that's where the real action lies. This is an easy path. It doesn't get us where we want to as fast as we would all like to go, but I don't think on this issue that we can avoid it because both sides of both political parties in Washington both are part of the military-industrial complex, lock, stock, and barrel.
Jim, as a body, Congress has an approval rating in the single digits, yet the rate of turnover for incumbent congressmen is actually lower than it was for members of the Soviet Politburo. Why is this?
Well, because we have rigged campaign finance election laws, and for third parties, we've also added on top of that ballot access laws that make it very difficult for them to compete. This is not a natural event. What has happened here is that they have made it as very, very difficult for a challenger to compete. The fact of the matter is, Gary, that money matters more to challengers. The ability to raise money and spend that money to get the message out, introduce a candidate, and begin to sell his message to voters matters far more to challengers than it does to incumbents. But yet it is far easier under our current campaign finance laws for incumbents to raise that money. And the problem is further compounded with things like the gerrymander, where your congressman you don't select your congressman selected you. He chose his set of voters so that he could guarantee that his party would continue to maintain control. So as long as he stays in good stead in his party, he knows that he's relatively reassured of his elections. And everybody wants to stay in good stead with their party. That's why they follow the leadership once they get to Washington, D.C. Instead of worrying as much about the concerns of their constituents back home, they just simply don't need to worry about it. They know if they keep their party happy, they're going to get reelected. All of these things must change if we're going to change the system that we're here. But I question the premise whether or not we even need these guys in the first place. I cannot recall a day, and I doubt you can either, and I doubt anybody watching can, that they woke up one morning and said, oh my gosh, I am so glad that we have a congressman to cast these votes for us. For why, if I had to make these decisions, I don't think I could do anywhere near as good a job. We all know better than that, and that is compelling reason enough to question whether or not they should be making all of these decisions that affect so many intimate details of our lives.
Jim, this brings me to my next question. What are the most effective things that concerned citizens can do to restore constitutional discipline to the Congress?
Well, it all starts with the people back home. We've got to win the battleground of our neighbor's mind, the district of their heart, and the precinct of their conscience. We don't have any other choice. You see, the people that are going off and serving us in Washington, D.C., if you could call it that, haven't been chosen by the Russians. They haven't been chosen by the Martians. They haven't even been chosen by our enemies, as bad as they are. They've been chosen by your neighbors, your family, your friends, your coworkers. That's who sent these people there and endorsed their policies. They voted for them, even if they were voting for the lesser of two evils in some cases. And we've got to make clear that both of these parties believe in the use of coercive force, the ability to use blunt force and threats of force and bribery to get people to do what they want them to do. And they're doing it with your dollars and in your name. And at some point, we have to learn how to withdraw our sanction, to deny consent. That is the important task before us. Again, it's not the easy path, but it's the only one that I see that has potential to give us the long-term success, the ability to curtail and get this state, federal state, back under control.